So this meeting is being recorded. If you don't want to be on a recorded meeting, you can drop. So welcome everyone. This is Joe Armstrong and the Power Systems Virtual User Group April webinar. And today, let's see, first of all, any announcements I have. Think 2021 is coming up, May 11th for the Americas. Big conference, no cost to customers to join this one day only, which is a little bit interesting. But lots of sessions on there for you, some labs, some hand-on stuff too if you want to get into that. Great stuff. So on the wiki page for the Power Systems VUG wiki page, you can, there's a link that you can go on and look at it and register for this if you'd like. There's also a link on there for Tech U sessions. So this is the conference that I really like, is the Ibm Tech U. And again, with all this COVID stuff, they're not doing a real conference right now for the spring. I haven't heard anything about later in the year, probably not till next year would be my guess. But they are doing some Tech U sessions. And there's not a single day, they're kind of spread out through the year. So there's a link on the wiki site that you can go to and you can see what the sessions are. It's a little bit weird, the interface to it. So when you look at the power one, there's a big box. Scroll down in that box and you'll see the ones for power, okay? Some of them you can register for already. Some of them, it says what they are, but registration isn't open up yet. So go there and you can get on some of the Tech U sessions. And I'm sure Jackie is somewhere in there with some Tech U sessions. So with that, let's get to today's topic. Today we're going to talk about NIM 201, so a little class going on here. And we've got Jackie Lynch with us today to talk about this. So Jackie, you know, normally I have IBM subject matter experts, and Jackie is not an IBMer, which is kind of nice and refreshing in some ways. So Jackie Lynch is actually more than 40 years of experience working with different projects and operating systems across a lot of platforms, including the mainframes, Unix, mid-range systems, and even personal workstations. So she's moved into primarily working on Unix in 1993, and since 99 has focused on power. So Jackie has been an IBM customer for over 22 years, which is kind of cool, and then worked for different business partners in the U.S. She's now an independent consultant. She focuses on enterprise architecture, virtualization, performance, security, lots of things, all things I'll say having to do with administration on power systems, primarily with AIX and Linux. I think there might be some things in this that you could pick up from the NIM server for IBMI as well, but her commands and stuff are really all on AIX and Linux. As I was saying, Jackie regularly presents at IBM conferences. I've seen her present several times. She's talked here on the user group multiple times, and it's always been great information. She presents well, and she's just a wealth of information. So with that, Jackie, I'll hand it over to you, and you can get started.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks, everybody, for taking time to attend. I know how busy everybody is. So in this presentation, it's called NIM 201 because I'll cover a little bit of the basics, but a lot of the very basic NIM stuff is not going to be covered, and I'll go through the introduction and setup pretty quickly. I do have an article that was published a while ago about using NIM with VIO, so we will touch on that, but we won't go into it again, as I said, in detail. So there's a whole bunch of cool things that you can do with NIM. You can install and maintain systems, which is what you typically expect to do, backup and restore, all of the things that are listed here. And then my new one, which I found out last Friday, is I can use Alt Disk Maxisb to save my life when I break my root VG. I was telling Joe earlier that it turns out that when you're in the cloud, if you're migrating disks from one tier to another, when you migrate your boot disk, it's a really good thing to boot from the new one before you detach the old one. And I'll talk a little bit later about how I used Alt Disk Maxisb to get my system back without having to do a complete reinstall. So this is going to be a combination of NIM and some of the Alt Disk stuff. So this is the basics. When you're when you're running a NIM server, it has to be at the highest level of AIX you plan to support. So normally when I'm doing upgrading, I upgrade my HMC, then my firmware, and then I will upgrade my NIM server before I upgrade my VIOs, because if I'm backing my VIOs up to my NIM server has to be at a level that can restore them. My NIM server is always set up with dedicated resources for the disk and network. Why is that? Because if I plan to back up my VIOs and restore my VIOs to and from a NIM server, I can't do that if the NIM server is dependent on the VIO that I'm trying to restore. So hopefully that makes sense. And I take the same attitude with TSM. Normally I just try to get a little 4-core server and have it be a dedicated NIM server, but you can do it with an LPAR as long as it has its own dedicated resources. Your other option is to have a NIM server on one server, a NIM LPAR on another server that are under the control of VIOs and do cross backups. I just find it easier to add a disk, a SAN card and a network card just for the NIM LPAR, and then I don't have to duplicate CPU and other resources. Most of the other stuff on here talks about creating a NIM file system. I normally have a couple of separate file systems, /NIM and /backups. They do not go in root VG. I like to keep my root VG very small and very clean. And this allows me to do Nfs exports of the backups directory and take backups directly into it for Maxisbs, which are then sitting on the NIM server in case I ever have to use them. A couple of other things about setup. NIM does not like you to put dots in the resource names, so we always use _. Setting up NIM is pretty straightforward. I normally create the /NIM file system in the NIM VG ahead of time, and I will create /tftp boot ahead of time. And then you can run this Nem Master command. You can point the device to dev cd0, or you can actually point it to whatever directory you have loaded all of the BFFs for AIX into. And then it builds a directory structure underneath it, that, for LPPs, images, and so on. On my 7.2 system, I'm running 7.251 right now. By next week, that NIM will be running 7.252. 7.252 just came out, so I don't normally upgrade any LPARs for at least 2 to 3 weeks until there's some patches out. But my NIM is the one exception I will make, because then I can get my resources pre-staged. So this is just showing you what it looks like right now. And I usually have an extra directory under /NIM called Maxisb, which is where I put converted Maxisb images. Going through checking the network setup, making sure that bootp and TFTP are uncommented. My inetd.conf is normally about 8 lines long because I delete everything out of it after saving it to a -orig file. And I do that so that when I run maintenance, if something gets uncommented, which maintenance is quite likely to do, I will know immediately because my file is going to show up those things. So you'll see I've uncommented bootp and TFTP because NIM uses those. If your security people like to scan your systems regularly, you can always leave those commented out. And when you want to do a NIM function, uncomment them, refresh inetd, do your NIM work, and then comment them back out. And if you use TCP wrappers, you cannot TCP wrap bootp and TFTP. You will break NIM. So a couple of things to think about. You also should check in Etsy services to make sure that these things are there. They should be, by default they are. And the thing you're more likely to run into is if you're going across firewalls or routers, sometimes they block bootp and TFTP. So you'll find that you're trying to NIM install something and you can't get a bootp or a TFTP back. So that's a conversation you may have to have with your security department. Now, this is a slide I added. If you downloaded the slides yesterday, you should download the new copy. So normally we get the DVDs from ESS, which is the IBM software repository. And basically, I always download the DVDs as ISO images. And nowadays, I only download the flash image because it's basically a combined image. instead of having DVD1 and DVD2, I end up with one 8 gig or 10 gig flash image. And I put it on my server, and then I use loop mount, which is a really useful command to basically mount that ISO, and then as if it's /CD-ROM, and then I can use SMIDI-BFF create from /CD-ROM to create my base directory. And then I also go get the updates from Fix Central and put those in a different directory. So pretty straightforward. And from there you go through creating your LPPs and spots and so on. And these, I have the commands here for creating an LPP source. And I usually have a directory of add-ons of things that sometimes are missing. And so I'll do a Nim update of the LPP. I also go and download the latest Java SSH and SSL packages, because I guarantee you that whatever comes out with any TL or service pack is not the latest Java and SSH and SSL, and they all have security holes in them. So I update my LPP with those. And then I may also add, if it's a NetApp, I'll add the NetApp drivers. You know, if it's whatever disk vendor it is, I will also load the packages for those into the LPP. And then I make sure it gets updated to the latest. I check it, and then I go create the spot from that LPP. And then I always do a check. Sometimes you may need to add boss alt disk boot install boot images. So there's the nim-o cust command that helps you to do that. At this point, you have an LPP and a spot, and you would be able to actually build an LPAR from those if you needed to. You can use ls-nim to list all your resources, and you can see here I've got quite a few of them. I support a bunch of different systems. So someone's asking about the PDF for the presentation. Joe's uploading it to the virtual user group site, and there's a link at the beginning of the presentation to grab it from my site as well. Right, so you can see here I have a Maxisb for VIO 312. I have a spot for it. Here's my LPP and spot for 72TL5 SP1. You can also look at just machines. You can run, look for Maxisb resources and so on. So this is just showing you some of the resources you have. One of the things that's useful is you can actually, if you're not sure if you have a particular file set in your LPP, you can use nim-o show res, and you can point it at the LPP and then do a grep on whatever it is that you're looking for. So in this case, I wanted to know if boss.suma and boss.alt were installed, and it actually showed me the level that they were installed at. And then I can do the same for Java or anything else. And using the -i on grep basically says I don't care whether it's Java with a capital J, Java with a lowercase j, case doesn't matter. So that's one way you can check whether the updates are actually in the LPP. This is just listing the directories and my Nim images and so on. I'm just going to skip past these. The one thing about Nim is if you have a lot of LPARs to support, you're going to need a lot of disk space to do it. Because just as an example, my backups and things like that, all the LPP sources I support, they're quite large. So you can see I have 452 gig and only 103 is free for just Nim, but I also have about a 400 or 380 gig backup directory and a software directory that I keep. And those are used to share out software updates and so on so that I can keep them all in one place. This is just more things to show you. And you can actually do an ls-nim on an LPAR, and it actually gives you what state it's in. It also gives you its CPU ID and a bunch of other things about it. You can do an ls-nim on an LPP, and it will tell you where it is physically, so you can check on it. And you can also look for this S-images. If it doesn't have an S-images yes, I think later on I talk about how to fix that, it will not create a bootable LPAR. So that S-images yes is important. And then in the spot, it actually will give you the exact level that it's planning to install. So that's quite useful. And again, you've got the same with the VIO stuff. So VIO 312.10 is actually AIX 7251. And it actually tells you that. So there's a number of ways you can update a resource. Add a resource. One, you can do it through SMIDI. I've done so many NIM updates now. I almost never use SMIDI for anything except for creating a Maxisb resource because I can never remember the syntax. But basically, this is the syntax to create a resource. I always create it from the base. And then depending what level the base is at, I'll do the NIM update packages all. And as you saw before, I'll go back and I'll add, SSH, SSL, Java, and any device specific, vendor specific things. And then define the spot. If resources are allocated to an LPAR and you need to get them unallocated and reset the LPAR, you can use the nim-o reset. 9 times out of 10, you'll need to use the force equals yes. I always try it without that first, and you can also do all of that through SMIDI. And in terms of setting up a client to restore from a Maxisb, basically the name has to be resolved, whether it's an etc host or in DNS. You create it as a nim machine object, and which is where you're going to find the machine. Make sure you select 64-bit as the kernel and nimsh as the shell. And nowadays it's nearly always n/a for the network. And you may want to create an image data file. The reason you would create an image data file is if maybe your Maxisb was a mirrored Maxisb, but you only have one disk to restore to, you can take care of that with a side, what they call a side image data file. So that's what this is talking about. You could say shrink equals no, you can go copies equals 1. If you don't create one, it will use the one embedded in the Maxisb image. So if your Maxisb was for mirrored, that Maxisb image is going to say mirrored. And this is just the steps to create the Maxisb resource. I normally copy the resource into /nim images first, and when I do the define of the Maxisb, I tell it not to bother copying it. Oops. And this is just showing you when you do the ls/nim -l and you grep Maxisb, it actually shows you get the information on what kind, the name, and where it's physically located, so you can double check that it is actually there. And again, this is just showing you for the Maxisb, for the Vio server, what level it is, and so on. And I always check that the image is there before I try to do the restore, because sometimes to save space, I'll move them back into /backups. So you should always do the ls just to make sure that you actually still have it. So then you go into SMIDI nim bosinst, and I usually go and allocate the resources and do a yes to accept the no licenses, tell it I'm installing from a Maxisb, and I tell it not to initiate now. I prefer to do what I call a pull, which is where I boot the LPAR in SMS mode, and I then set it up for remote IPL so that I can actually monitor the whole thing while it's going on. Some people prefer to push it out from the NIM server. I prefer to do the pull. So it's entirely up to you, but initiate no now equals no means that I have to boot the LPAR into SMS mode to do the network boot. This is just showing you what a bosinst, my SMIDI bosinst looks like. So I've got the LPP name, the spot name attached, the Maxisb. I'm telling it to do a Maxisb install. You've got to accept the new license agreements. Don't ever make the mistake of choosing preview them. and I'm going to remain a Nim client, and I'm going to initiate it now null. So that means I'm going to do a pull. And that's what the ls nim shows afterwards. It says I'm ready. I'm enabled for a boss install. Here's all the stuff we're going to use. Let's go. I usually do some checks before I do the show mount to make sure I see the exports. I check that it actually shows at the end of boot ptab. And I also check TFTP boot to make sure I see the .info files and so on. And just checking those things can help you avoid a lot of problems. All right, I mentioned the simages file. If you look at your LPP and it says simages equals no, you can use this nim -o update command with the recover equals yes, and it will actually change the simages so that you ensure you create a bootable image. I haven't had simages equals no show up for years, but just because I haven't seen it lately doesn't mean it can't happen. So it's just a good thing to have in your back pocket. The rest of this is on deallocating and allocating and so on, and some examples of how to add a package and how to remove package and so on. And then I have the link here for Alt-Root VG op, which I'm going to talk about a bit more. All right, if you have to back out from a install, like I said, you can just use the nim -o reset, and you can use the nim deallocate. And sometimes after an LPM move, you used to have to reset the CPU ID for nim. I haven't had to do that for a long time either, but that's a good one to remember if you start to have problems. So in terms of installing a VIO server from the HMC or from NIM, if your network is aggregated, it's not going to let you do an install. There is a way, if you're doing a pull from NIM, that you can tell it that it's an aggregated port, but otherwise you're not going to be able to do it from the HMC. So if I'm doing HMC installs for the VIO, I will typically have them give me an access port either separately or first, and then I'll have them aggregated after the install's done. But just be aware you may run into that if you're using aggregated networks. It doesn't affect the LPARs running under the VIO, it's just the VIOs, or if you have a dedicated LPAR that has aggregated networks, you may have to work around that. So, as I said, there are a couple of ways around it. The other thing you'll run into is before you can do a NIM install, you usually have to have some disks, and the SAN team might need you to light up the adapters so they can do their zoning and mapping. And just to be clear, there's a difference between zoning and mapping. Zoning is what happens at the switch. Mapping is what happens at the disk to subsystem. And you have to have both to be able to see the disks. I got a situation right now where the stuff is zoned, but it's not mapped, so I can't see any disks. Your NIM install is not going to go very well if you can't see any disks. So if you're using LPM, one of the things that you're going to want to do, makes your life easier, is go to the HMC, go to the profile for the LPAR, and manage the profile and go to virtual adapters. And then actually you can just click on any one of the virtual adapters. You don't have to click all of them. And if you go to Actions, Advanced, Login, Logout Fiber, you have the option to basically log in all the fibers, including the LPM ones. There's a really good document about this that I've got a link to. I also have a document linked about NIM LED hangs that will indicate whether you have this. Just a couple of other good things. IBM's now recommending AIX PCM rather than STD PCM. They have some really good documentation on MPIO. I just checked all these links and they are still valid. So I would suggest if you want to use MPIO, start looking at those. All right, back to NIM. So we're booting into SMS mode. This is where your spreadsheet of documentation comes in handy because you actually need to know which Ethernet adapter it's really on. Here I say select one for first Ethernet, but actually you need to know which Ethernet adapter it is. You may have 3 or 4 adapters and only one of them's connected. So you have to pick the right one. Then you got to set all your IP parameters. So the client is your actual client, what it's going to be, your servers, a Nim server, and so on. And I normally disable spanning tree. And the protocol, I think, is where you go and you can set it to aggregated there, and it may work. Then I go into a ping test. If the ping test works, you have a good chance that your Nim install will work. Not 100% chance, because there are other factors that can get you, like firewalls. If your ping doesn't work, absolutely, you need to resolve that first. And sometimes ping doesn't work because they block ping. So for next steps, your LPAR will boot. You'll see TFTP start. Actually, they've gotten bigger, so it's now anywhere from 30,000 to about 70,000 packets. What is really bizarre is it does it twice. So you see the TFTP end, and then it starts again, and you go, okay, it's broken. No, it does it twice. I have no idea why. It just does. Then the usual stuff of, English. I'm getting a lot more this message about the disks aren't the same, and I have no reason not to go forward with it. I always check my install settings though, and I make sure that the correct HDisk is chosen. This is the point at which you'll find out if your disks were mapped, because if you see no disks, then they're not mapped. So I pick my disk and basically let it do the install. If you didn't use a side image data file and it's mirrored, you'll need to provide 2 disks to restore. Other than that, you should be good to go. All right. You can monitor it using ls-nim -ll name. You can also watch it from the HMC and monitor the reference codes, or you can just go get a coffee and come back in 15 minutes so that you don't stress over the fact that it might hang. I always, when I'm doing an install, I use VT menu on the HMC to get a console. I don't like using the Java-based console that you can click on at the HMC. I find the one on VT menu is a lot nicer. So there's a bunch of useful commands for Nim. I'm not going to go into these. They're just good to have in your back pocket. And this is showing you the output of some of them, which we've already looked at. So on your master, there's going to be a Nim info file, and this is what they refer to as part of the Nim database. Pretty much what it's going to say is the Nim name, the fact that it's the master, what the ports are that it uses. And it's important to note these, because if they're blocking ports at your firewall and they won't open these two, you can change the ports here and in the clients to use a different port. This is actually the combination of Etsy Nim Info, Etsy Repodge Nim Star, and Var Adm Nim Star is what we call your Nim database. There is no real database per se. Your Nim logs are kept in this /var adm ras nim star. And basically, if you're having connection issues, you can look at nimsh.log. And then there's a Nim log, which is your general log. And you can look at these logs using a log. Don't try to look at them by viewing them, because they're in a log format. So so you can back up your Nim database basically by copying these files and saving them. And then you can restore it by copying them back and reactivating the Nim master. So it's a good idea to save these files periodically. Not that it's that hard to rebuild Nim if you have to. You have to have this file on your master and on your running Nim clients. You can rebuild it on the master using this nim config command, or you can rebuild it from a running Nim client by using the nim init command. And of course, you can see if Nim's running on the master by checking init tab. This is what your NIM info looks like on the client. And you can see here, there's your master port and registration port and all of the other different details. So again, if you need to change the ports, then you would be changing, 1058, 1059 to match whatever you put in the master and whatever they enabled at the firewall. Now, I'm going to get into some of the more interesting stuff like migrations and updates. A migration is required if you are changing a version or a release. An update preserves the version and release. It's basically a technology level of service pack. So AIX 6.1 to 7.1 or 7.1 to 7.2 is really a migration. They can use alternate copies of the root VG, and you can have it boot from the alternate copy and immediately, or you can control when that happens. As I said, I always do my Nem Master first, then I create my LPPs and spots or update the current ones and work from those. I use Nim Adm for migrations. I also use it to install a down level Maxisb. So as an example, you can use it to take an AIX 6.1 Maxisb and migrate it to an AIX 7.2 Maxisb, and then use that Maxisb to install a new image without impacting the LPAR that's currently running. You can even install that new image on another disk in that LPAR and boot from it later. There's you can use a combination of Nim Adm and alt disk Maxisb. Oops. And you can use Nim alt clone is what you would use when you want to do a TL or an SP. You can also use multiboss, but I actually don't like multiboss. I'd rather have a complete spare disk so I don't get confused about what I did. But that's personal taste. So one of the things that you do want to do is I take all my LPARs do Maxisbs to my NIM server. So I have a directory /backups that gets mounted locally on the LPARs as /user local backups. I take all my Maxisbs to there. And then if I want to use a Maxisb image, I'll copy it to /nim/images. So one of the things, and I haven't really put it on here, but one of the things that you really want to do is most people have some product out there that backs up all their data, but they don't have anything other than NIM that backs up their Maxisbs, and that's fine, but please back up your NIM server. You need to be taking a Maxisb of your NIM server to somewhere that can go off-site if necessary, and you also need to be taking a volume group backup of NIM VG so that you can get all your resources back rather than rebuild them. And obviously you need to back up this backups directory, right? You don't want to lose all those Maxisbs if something happens to the NIM server and you have to rebuild an LPAR. So have a backup strategy for your NIM VG, your actual NIM server, and for the backups directory on your NIM server. I have a software directory there too. I put them in NIM VG so that when I do my save VG on NIM VG, I get it all. But just think, however you do it, just make sure that you actually have a strategy for backing up your NIM server, because that's the thing you're going to use to restore everybody else. Now, Nim Adm is the alternate disk migration. You can do some cool things. You can create copies of root VG. You can do a simultaneous migration while you're doing that. You can create new Maxisb resources. You can update Maxisb resources. You can do a lot of different things. So if I look at what this current command does, I am telling it the -B says don't rewrite the boot list. By default, Nim Adm is always going to rewrite your boot list, and you may not want to do that because you might not want to boot from this. It's going to do for LPAR 3, it's going to use this LPP and this spot, and it's going to build a system on HDisk 2 in verbose mode, and it will accept agreements. If you want to run in debug mode, you can add a -D. In this case here, I'm actually taking a Maxisb image, which is called CG-AIX61, and I am writing it as cg-aix71 into the /export/maxisb/cg-aix71 directory after I upgrade it using this spot and this LPP, and the volume group is Nim Adm VG. So this is how you would actually upgrade a Maxisb image to prepare it for use if you wanted to do a boot. You don't have to write it to a location like export Maxisb CG-aix71. You could put -DH disk 3 there and have it write it straight to a disk, whichever one you prefer. I like to actually write the Maxisb to a Maxisb file because then I can use the showres command and look for things that sometimes get screwed up. And as an example, I had a typo in my inetd.conf and on the AIX61 system. It didn't stop the system running, it didn't stop the network running, but when I did the migration, inetd.conf didn't get copied because there was a typo in it. And so even though it was functional, it wouldn't copy it. So I found that using showres. You can use Nim, and you can use Alt Disk Copy to do cloning. So I can actually copy my current root VG to another disk. As I said, I always use the -B flag. I still check boot list afterwards. And if I want to change it to HDisk 2 I will. Actually, you can't do a boss boot against HDisk 2 until it's actually root VG. But whenever I'm rebooting a system, I always run a boss boot against the current root VG, and I check the boot list and run boot info -B just to make sure that I don't have a corrupt boot list. I don't care if it was rebooted 3 days ago. I always take those 3 steps because I've been bitten too often by a bad boot list. So I just always do this. And under the covers, IBM actually uses Alt Disk Copy when you do a version 3 Vio Server upgrade. That's why you're required to have a second free disk when you go from version 2 to version 3, because under the covers, they're basically using alternate disk copy, even if you do it from Nim. You can use this for updating within the same version. And you could do SMIDI alt clone, Nim alt clone, specify target client and target disks, and basically tell it the fixes to install, and it will do a clone to the target disk, and then it will put the patches on from the LPP source and everything that you identify. And it will do it on the alternate disk root VG while you're still running on root VG. So, if you're in an environment where you're not using live update, or you can't use live update, as an example, GPFS, this allows you to basically at least get it done on alternate install root VG and get it ready to re-IPL. And like I said, if you're not planning on rebooting immediately, make sure the boot list is set back, because the last thing you want to have happen is you get everything ready the day before and you have a maintenance window, let's say on Saturday, but something happens Friday night and the system reboots and suddenly you did an unplanned upgrade. So always check that boot list. I mentioned multi-boss. Like I said, I don't really use it, but it allows you to have 2 root VGs on the same disk and you can maintain them separately. I personally find it confusing, so I just don't use it, but it is something that you have the ability to use. So as part of the Nim world, Nim will use alternate disk install for some things. So I want to talk a little bit about just pure alternate disk install. You do have to have on your Nim server the boss alt disk install RTE installed. Also on your client LPARS if you want to use it there. And then you can, as I said, you clone root VG with SMIDI alt clone or alt disk copy. And you'll see a disk that shows up after the clone as alt_root VG. That's going to be the clone, and you can set your boot list to it and reboot from it. You can also rename that. So maybe you're doing something where you don't want to get rid of the alt_root VG you had because the upgrade's not old enough. You can use alt_root VG op to rename it to whatever you want, and then just use another disk for your alternate disk install, assuming you have another disk to use. So there's lots of things you can do. This is just an example of, using alternate disk to install Maxisb on an alternate disk. And, I made sure all the BOS alt disk boot images and install RTE were installed. And this is on the actual LPAR, or it could be on your NIM server if you're doing maintenance on your NIM server. So you basically point it to the Maxisb, and this is where you would specify a different image data file if you wanted to. I'm telling it not to set the boot list and not to reboot and to give me verbose input. Now, all of this is in the long commands I gave you before, but this is like what it looks like on SMIDI. So the first thing it's going to do is create the alternate root VG, and then it will create all of the normal logical volumes with alt underscore in front of them. And then it will restore the image, etc. So it goes through several phases. But my mouse is very touchy. Right. What you'll see now is that I now have a root VG and an alternate root VG. And my phase 1 is where it creates all the logical volumes. Phase 2 is where it runs any customization scripts. And then phase 3, it unmounts everything and sets the ODM and varies off the alternate root VG. When it's running, you can actually run LSPV on the 2 disks, and you'll see that for every disk on my root VG disk, it's creating a copy of it with alt in front of it on the other one. So you can kind of keep an eye on that and see whether the stuff's getting copied. At the end, it all gets varied offline and you can't see the alt ones anymore. But if, for instance, let's say you do your maintenance today, and between today and tomorrow, something changes in Etsy hosts that you need to have on the new copy, you can actually wake it up using alt disk install wake, and then you can go into /alt-inst/etc/hosts, and you can make the change and then put it back to sleep. So the way we do it now is we actually use the alt root VG op command to wake it up and to put it to sleep. It used to be alt disk install. They basically do the same thing. This is just showing you a DF. If I monitor with df-g, I can actually see how quickly it's going through loading all of these file systems. Because, like, as an example here, /var is 38% full up here. Down here it's 38%. But as I monitor them, I can see differences. And then when it's finished, normally I don't bother. I just watch the command go through because I do it in verbose mode. You can also do a quick alt disk copy where I basically say, I want you to take the current running operating system, in this case it was 7100. I want you to copy it to HDisk1. While you're at it, I want you to update it to this maintenance level out of the /updates directory. This command will, if you don't use that -B, it will reset your boot list. But it lets you copy the running system and apply maintenance in one step. After the reboot, and this is the case, anytime that you reboot from alt-inst root VG, when you come up, you'll see that the old root VG is called old_root VG. You can remove it later if you want with alt root VG_op. You can also rename it if you want to keep it around. You have options. So this is an example of migrating a 7.1 Maxisb to 7.2. And this is one where I had issues, so I actually was checking the Maxisb with listvg backup to make sure it had rc.tcp/ip and inetd.conf in there. So I'm converting my AIX7.1 Maxisb that I took to an AIX7.2.1, and this is the command. So the JL Maxisb May 2317 is actually the AIX7.1, and then you can see here that I've got 7.2 in the names. And then I can do my list VGs again, and I always check for these two now because of problems I had in the past. You can then copy it to the client and use alt disk Maxisb to install it. So you have a choice. You can, if the client's up and running and it has a spare disk, you could just copy this across, use Alt Maxisb to install it on the disk, or you can set the client up for a Maxisb install and, you know, go into SMS mode and pull it from there. So, and this is discussing down here the little bug that we had. There's some other tricks that I learned just recently that I've found very useful. Like I said, renaming a VG. So I had to do something with an alt disk install to test something. So I renamed my current alt disk install, inst root VG to next root VG, so I'd remember that I needed to go back to it. This is the command that I found really, really useful, which we just looked at anyway. But basically, I can take a Maxisb and attach a disk to another system. If I've trashed my root VG, put the Maxisb on it, detach the disk, and copy it across. And in the cloud, I have that ability to do the attaches and detaches. Obviously, in your data centers, if you're not in the cloud, you're going to have to work with the SAN people, unless you are the SAN people. But this really did save my life on Friday night, so I wanted to put it in there. And I've got the links to the commands. I mentioned the list VG backup command, and you know, we've used it earlier on, but this allows you to search for any particular file in a Maxisb image. And you can use this on things other than things related to NIM. You know, if you've taken a backup of data and you want to see if a particular file is in there, you can use list VG backup to look at the volume root backup for that file, that file should be in, and check that it's in there. So I talked about setting up resources, and one of the things for the Vio server, so we're going to talk Vio and NIM now. In order to set up Nem resources for the Vio server, you never ever use an LPP. You don't even create one. You use the Maxisb image that comes on in the ISO, and you create Maxisb resources, and you create the spot from the Maxisb. So what's important to know is if you download both of the DVD ISOs for the Vio server, there are 3 Maxisb images you have to concatenate together in the right order. If you download the flash image, which is the only one I bother with anymore, A, it's more recent, and secondly, there is one Maxisb image that you have to copy. So you basically, I use loop mount to mount the ISO. I go find the Maxisb image and I copy it into /nim/images/ and I give it a name like, you know, Vio server 31210 flash Maxisb image. So I know what it is. And then I define it as a Maxisb image. Once I've got that, I can define the spot from that Maxisb image that I can then use to restore and build Vio servers. And we can check that Maxisb image to make sure it's what we think it is. So here it's 725.1.2038, which is what 312.10 should be. We could check the spot and make sure it looks good. And then you can work with it. Now, you can use NIM to backup, install, and update your Vio server. So, but you have to make sure that AIX is at our NIM is at the correct level. Now, IBM has a page which is your NIM to Vio server mapping. Unfortunately, it's not been updated since 2019. So you have to read the README description files when you download the NIM software. Sorry, the Vio software. So I can tell you that as of right now, on April 16th, IBM released Vio 3.1.2.21. They also released AIX 7252. And 3.1.2.1.21 requires 7252 on NIM. So I think it's a little bit early to go to that Vio level. I'm probably going to wait another couple of weeks, but I'll probably upgrade my NIM server now because I can take a backup first. I've put the link to the README for the VIO. And the other thing about 32121 is you have to be at 312 before you can put it on. So I'm at 31210, so it's not a problem, but just be aware of that. It's very important that you read those READMEs. You can use Nim to actually do the update of a VIO server, where you basically like you wouldn't point it to an LPP, you'd point it to a spot. So what I would typically do is I would do an alternate disk install anyway. If you're not using it to update the VIO server, then you can use the update iOS command on the VIO or alt root VG. One of the things you do not want to do on a VIO server is use SMIDI. You should not be doing SMIDI update all on your NIM server ever. You should always be using the update iOS command and pointing it to the images that you got with the VIO server. You never point update iOS at an AIX725 directory. So to install Nim, a VIO server from Nim, I copy the Maxisb image. I mentioned the fact that there's 3 of them, but honestly, just use the single one from the flash image. I define the Maxisb resource, I define the spot. I always copy the BOSINST data from the VIO server, create a separate VIO server BOSINST resort, and then I use SMIDI Nim BOSINST to do a Maxisb install once I define the partition profile. Pretty straightforward stuff. This is the man page for Nim -o update iOS. Interesting thing is that they actually misspell update iOS at the very top, but hey, we can live with it. Now, there are 2 versions. If you're going from version 2 to version 3 of the VIO server, it is not an update, it is an upgrade, and you have to use VIOS upgrade. You can use the Nim VIOS upgrade command, or you can use the VIOS upgrade command on the VIO server. They do the same thing, but they have different syntax. So whatever your strategy is going to be, you need to pick a strategy and stick with the same one so you don't get confused about the syntax. I tend to do my VIOS upgrade on the VIO server, but other people use Nim for it. So you have the ability to do either. Just I recommend picking one. And this is the man on the VIOS upgrade, and you want to make sure that you do understand how it works. So here it's a VIOS upgrade to an alternate disk on this host, and you know what the iOS Maxisb is, where am I going to put it, etc., etc. There's a couple of different ways you can back up your VIO server. The first thing is you need to use VIOSBR to back up your VIO server regularly. That backs up your virtual resources. Because when you do a restore from a Maxisb, it doesn't recreate all your VFC mappings and all the things that you really care about. So you want to run this VIOSBR backup command. And actually, when you do a version 3 upgrade, that's one of the first things you do. I actually have it set up so it runs in my cron tab every day. So it automatically backs up the virtual definition resources every day. Now, there's also 2 different kinds of backup iOS. One of them creates a Nim resources tar file, and that can be used to clone or restore your VIO server from the HMC using install iOS. The other one is a Maxisb that can be used to restore your VIO server from your Nim server as a Maxisb image. I always take both kinds of backups because that way I have more options. If you prefer one over the other, then just pick that one. So this is my little backup script, and it basically mounts the these 2 are in the wrong order. It should say mount then make dir. I always unmount if I'm using the file-backed optical, which is var VIO VM library, I always unmount that. And the reason I unmount it is because there's a bug. And even though I say no media lib, it will back up that VM library. Well, if it's in root VG, that's a problem, because it could be 60 gig and I don't want a huge backup. So I always unmount it. I run my 2 backups. This first one is the one that is going to do the resources.tar that I would use for the HMC. And the second backup is a pure Maxisb. And then I remount the VM library and I exit. So one other note, which I'm sure most of you know, I use NFS to share out my backups and software file systems. I don't allow any of NFS mount to mount automatically at boot. When I set Etsy file systems, it says mount equals no. If they have to mount at boot, at the very bottom of a init tab, I add a 2: once for rc.local, and in rc.local I have all my mount commands. If you set it to mount equals yes, then what happens is when rc.nfs runs, which is a 2: wait, it will try to do all your NFS mounts. And if any of them, let's say the NFS server is down, you will be waiting for a very long time until it times out. And if you're doing a reboot, I've had it be 3 or 4 hours. So I highly recommend that you do not put NFS mounts with mount equals yes in your Etsy file systems. And this becomes important when you're starting to use things like Nim, etc., because you will be using NFS mounts to share all the software around. All right, this is just showing you what happens when you run the backup iOS. You can see that it does a save VG. And then I can see that I built a Nem Resources tar, and they're not small. They can be anywhere from 20 to 40 or 50 gig, and the same with your Maxisb. So make sure that the backup file system has plenty of space. Now this is really cool, and I'm actually going to try this later today. If your HMC is at 950, you can now back up your Vio configuration and put it in the HMC and restore it later. And you can also perform a Vio server backup and actually back up your Vio server directly to the HMC. That's something we've not had before, and it's something that, as long as you've got the space on your HMC, is a very useful thing to have. I will note that HMC 950 initially was only supported on the Power HMC, and by the way, IBM just announced the new Power 9 version of the HMC, but they went back and they said, okay, we'll support it on the Intel CR9. But this is the time when you need to start looking at going to the new Power HMCs, because I doubt that anything past HMC 950 will run on the CR9. But this is a very cool thing. I learned about it from Manjunath's blog, and as I said, I'm going to try it later today. If you are restoring from your Nem Resources tar, then these are some of the steps that you'll take. You can untar it and get it all ready to go, and then you'll need to do some things on the HMC. And that's what this is going. We have to use the install iOS command to actually do it. I prefer to use the Vio Server Maxisb that I took. So it's a standard Maxisb restore, and you do a pull from the server. There is a link here that you can download from IBM that actually talks about doing that backup and restore. I highly recommend you read it. I've talked about this before, but you can actually clone disks, which is sort of what I was doing with my alt disk Maxisb before. But if I've built one VIO and I don't have any way across the network or anything to build the second one because I'm still waiting for a network, I can always use alt disk copy and then take the second side of the internal disks and remove them from that VIO, and then boot the second VIO from them. There's a cleanup process you have to go through if you do that, and it has to do with clearing node IDs, and otherwise what will happen, you get weird RMC issues. So I did this once. I built a VIO, cloned it to another disk, removed that disk, put it on the other VIO, booted the other VIO, and RMC on the first VIO went down, and it was because of this UUID. So if you do anything like this where you're cloning things because it's quicker you do have cleanup work you have to do, or you're going to see some really bizarre results. And that's what these couple of cleanup slides are talking about. So in terms of uninstalling Nim, it's basically you can Nim -o unconfig master, and you can uninstall the Nem Master file set. But you have to unconfigure it first. A couple of things on Nfs Exports. Nim uses Nfs Exports when it's ready to do things. So you cannot ever export anything in /Nim using NFS. If you do that, you'll break Nim. Now, there is a way to do it where you can do some settings that say we could do it. I personally, the things that I export are /backups and /software, so I just make them separate file systems. And then I never run into any issues with Nem resources. If you don't want to watch the progress, you can always tell it not to tell you. I like to see what's happening, but it's entirely up to you. The other thing that you may want to do, and this is particularly if you're under the control of a VIO, you might want to set up a second Nim server, which would be an alternate Nem Master, and you could set that up on the other server. And this is the steps that you would go through to actually build a second Nem Master. And then you cross-register them with each other so they know that each other exists. And you have the ability to take over, you have the ability to remove it. There's a lot of things you can do. But having that second Nim server does take up obviously twice as much disk. What kind of problems can you see? The first thing that happens is when you're doing the network boot is boot P makes an initial communication, talks to the client. After that's successful, it uses TFTP. If you hang on a U0608, it's nearly always a boot P or TFTP problem. And that's when you go through and check that all the settings are correct in inetd.conf and boot P tab, the gateway, checking your firewall. You may end up having to run it in debug mode. So I've got the instructions here for doing that. For TFTP, like I said, I always check etc TFTP boot to make sure all the .info files are there, that if I have a /etc/tftp access.control file that actually is letting me use TFTP boot. And I just check all these things. And again, you can run TFTP as well in debug mode. And then there's a document here on troubleshooting those Nim hacks. So a few little extra tips. If you're using any of the alt commands, always check your boot list before and after. I normally will do a bootinfo-b and a boot list -m normal -o. Whenever I go to reboot, I rewrite my current boot image and check my boot list. Then I don't mind going ahead and I'll boot from the current system or boot from the updated one. These are the things I just do automatically to keep myself out of trouble. All right, so with that said, I'm going to try to figure out how to get out of show mode. I don't know how we're doing on time, but if anyone's interested, I can show you any of the commands that you might be interested in.
We have about 25 minutes or so left, Jackie, so feel free to demo some stuff. That'd actually be pretty good.
That might be quite amusing to back up a VIO server. I haven't done this yet.
Hey.
Yeah, so this basically lets me, so this is the HMC at 950. And you can go into templates and OS images and there's this new thing, which is manage VIO server backups. So if I click on that, and can you guys see this? I know it's kind of small. I have a 4K screen, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's kind of small, but you can kind of tell where you're at. Anyway, it's hard to read the text, but we can kind of tell where you're at. Okay. Then if you click on the backup IO configuration, it actually lets me back up. So I'm going to call it VIO2-IO backup. And I'm going to apply it and see what it does. It says create backup operations in progress. Please check task log. Once it succeeds, kindly refresh the panel.
All right, so I guess we refresh the panel. So it can't take that long to back up my IO configuration. So what that just went and did was it supposedly went and did a VIO SBR on my VIO2 and backed it up to the HFC. And there it is. So if I needed to, I could rename it, restore it, or remove it. I'm not going to do any of those things. And then you have the ability to do a VIO server backup as well. I'm not going to do that right now because it would just take too long. But that's kind of cool stuff that you can do that literally just came out with 950. So one of the other things that, one of the other commands I found really useful is sometimes you'll do an LSPV and you'll see root VG, but you don't see an alternate root VG, and you have to figure out what is the alternate disk. So like if I do an LSPV rep root, right now I have them, but if I do an LSPV grep none, you know, I may want to do a clone to that disk. Well, one of the things you can do is use this lsmpio-ql command against the disk. So I'm going to look at HDisk 10, and it actually tells me, because I actually name my volumes with sensible names, that this volume name is NimVG 200 gig NimVG7. So that I know that that's supposed to be a disk in my Nim volume group. When I look at the equivalent for my root VG, it has RTVG in the name, and it's 100 gig. So that lsmpio-ql command is actually very useful when you're doing things with Nim, and actually just in general. So is there anything else people would want to see on my Nim server, or am I going to give you back 20 minutes of your day?
Well, we've got some questions out there, Jackie.
Okay, well,
maybe we want to.
Let me stop sharing the screen then.
And I think maybe you might have answered this. Somebody just said, "Can we restore a Nim from another Nim?"
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're doing is restoring a Maxisb. So what you would do, is shut it down and build have the Maxisb image, and then just do a pull restore. So you have a lot of different options.
Okay. So Tom Prokop has been out answering some questions as well. So Tom, I'll just say, if you have something you want to ask or put out here to Jackie, just go ahead and pipe up. I'm just going to scroll through here myself and see what I find here.
I see one that Tom answered about if your NIM is at the latest level, what's the earliest release of AIX you can restore? I'm with him. Basically, as long as you've got the original source that you can build the resources from, you should be able to go back to at least 5.3. I hope you don't have to, but I know you can restore 6.1 and so on. Pretty much before 5.3, I wouldn't want to bet on it.
Yep.
And someone asked about logs for Maxisb verification. When I run a Maxisb, I can output it to a log and go look at that log, or I can monitor it myself. It's up to you.
Somebody asked that the security team is requesting TFTP to be disabled, and what are the alternatives to TFTP, or will there be something in the future?
I can't answer about futures. I can tell you that you don't have an option other than TFTP and boot P. But what I do with the security team is I simply tell them that I don't have an option of doing that. So I disable TFTP and boot P except for when I want to use them. Then they got to catch me with a scan. So literally it's commented out and I uncomment it refresh inetd, do whatever it is I want to do, comment it back out, and refresh inetd.
Hey, Jackie, there was a question out there about time zones that I could not answer. Where you got NIM clients in different time zones than the NIM Master, and how does NIM deal with that? And does it mess up the time zone because the NIM client typically gets reset when you do a -D? I have no experience with alternate time
I use
zones.
NTP on all my systems, and I do deal with things in different time zones. So what I do is it's one of the things I check afterwards. If you're restoring from a Maxisb, it's going to look in Etsy environment and use the time zone that's in Etsy environment from the Maxisb that you took. So you're not going to have an issue there. If you are building a new build, at the end of the new build, you're going to have to go and set the time zone, but you would have to do that even for the current time zone that you're in. So it doesn't change your time zone. It won't refuse to do a restore because your time zone doesn't match. It doesn't actually care, but it is something that, you know, you do want to check after you do a restore or install.
So, Jackie, somebody's asking in the chat session, so this is a little bit different, maybe a different topic, but I'll throw it at you anyway. Have you used Ansible to install NIM server or manage AIX environments, and have you seen some activities for Ansible to manage AIX VIO?
So it's one of the things on my long list of things I have to get around to, which is using Ansible, because I actually do a lot of work with Red Hat Linux as well. And I honestly, the short answer is no, I haven't, because I just haven't had time. So okay. It is on the list of things to check with.
Okay.
And there's one that I get regularly, but I'd like your thoughts on it, Jackie. NIM server with multiple IP interfaces, either physical or just IP nets on it. I think that's pretty common given different zones. Can you comment on that?
I'm sorry,
Can you manage that?
You went very quiet.
Okay.
I had a hard time hearing you.
Yeah, sorry. A NIM server with multiple IP interfaces on it. How would you handle that? And making sure that the right IP interface is picked, et cetera.
So you're talking about the fact that they have a NIM server supporting systems in different subnets, and they're using different interfaces to go to those subnets?
Yes.
So you basically have to pay a lot of attention to what's in the end of your boot PTAB. Make sure that it's got the correct gateway in there and the correct server IP and client IP. And then when you do the SMS poll, you need to make sure that they match what's in the boot PTAB. I mean, you could do it, but and a lot of the reason people do it is because of firewalls. So they'll have a direct connection into that subnet, so they don't have to deal with firewall issues. Somebody was asking about the virtual HMC supporting the VIO backups. Honestly, I don't know. The virtual HMC on power, I would suspect, would do it. I don't know about, because you have to be at 950. I don't think 950 is supported on the VM virtual HMC on Intel. In fact, I'm not even sure they're supporting that anymore at all. Do you have any idea, Tom?
Well, we do support the virtual HMC on Intel still. I don't know if it supports 950. I would expect that it will, but I'm not positive.
Pull up the,
I have to go look it up. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it will. I mean, most of the people that use the virtual HMC actually use it on Intel, or so I was told. So I would think that probably they would support that.
There's a question out here that I thought was interesting because it ties into LPM, live partition mobility. And when you do an LPM, you get a different CPU ID, and that can affect your NIM client.
Yeah, I had one of the slides in there. I think I mentioned that you
Yeah.
may have to do something. Let me just go look for it.
So while you're looking for that, so Bob Crawford actually texted or put in the chat that the VHMC on x86 does support the 950 version.
Yeah, I just opened the README and it says that it does, so that's good. So on slide 30, I mentioned that you may have to use the nim-o change -a CPU ID after an LPM move. And that's what you're referring to, Tom.
Okay.
So is there anything else that we?
Kind of scrolling through here.
Yeah, you're quite correct, by the way, whoever commented on 940 to 950 being much larger. Yes. And don't forget, with your power HMCs, you also need to update your BMC, which is basically a firmware update to the HMC.
I'm getting down there. Tom answered a bunch of these, which was good. Thank you, Tom. So you had mentioned you wait a few weeks. So there's a question, somebody's looking for a rule of thumb on how long to wait for the next O-level, TL, SP, whatever, whether it's a month, 2 months, or whatever. Your rule of thumb is a couple of weeks, Jackie, or longer?
So my NIM server, I'm not quite as, I might, like I said, it came out on the 16th. I'm probably going to update my NIM server today. I would have updated it sooner, but I haven't had time. For my LPARs, for test, I might do it sooner, but for development and production, it really depends on how brave you are. And how risk averse you are. For some people, there's a feature that they need. There's a lot of things fixed in SP2. So for a lot of people, they're going to want to go to SP2 very, very quickly for 725. Same with the Vio servers, they're going to want to go to those quickly, but you need to do your NIM server first. So it's very hard for me to tell you what a rule of thumb is. I have friends in the business that will not go to a service pack till the next service pack is out. And then I'm like, well, why would you go to a service pack that has bugs? So I like to give it 2 or 3 weeks so that if there are problems, somebody else finds them. I like to see that FlirtVC's apar.csv file has been updated since the release came out. So at least if there's efixes or ifixes, I'll at least get the initial ones. So, yeah, someone's made the comment about IBM I customers being probably very happy about the ability to back up a VIO to the HMC. The thing they might not be happy about is that you have to go to 950, and if they've been around for a while, they probably have a HMC that doesn't support 950.
Somebody asked, do you ever use any post-install script objects in NIM?
I did for a while when I was doing some stuff with NetApp. I had a script that did configuration stuff, but for the most part, not. Most of my installs are I build the first environment, take a Maxisb, and then push everything else out if it's a new install. Otherwise, it's just updates. So I really don't use a lot of post-install scripts. It's actually something I need to do more experimenting with. And yeah, that's a good point that Zoe's making, that you could use post-install scripts for resetting root passwords on old Maxisbs. That is true. If you don't remember what the root password was, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, somebody asked, is it better to use alt disk copy or alt root VG to create a clone to patch via iOS servers?
I think it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah, okay.
I tend to use alt disk copy just because I have it memorized. But I don't think it actually really matters. You know, it's the same as you can use alt disk install or alt root VG op. IBM's preference nowadays is for you to try to use alt VG, root VG op more. So they do the same thing.
So I'm not sure if this question has a context, Jackie, so I'm not sure, but it says in the image.data file, do you need to break the mirror by changing the number of copies from 2 to 1?
Well, it depends. If you did a Maxisb of a mirrored root VG, then you have two choices when you do the restore. You can provide it with 2 disks to restore to, or you can create a side image data file that where you tell it copies equals 1 and it will only restore to the 1 disk. So I almost never have mirrored root VGs anymore, because if I'm on the SAN, I will have a second disk, but that's always my alternate copy.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm on internal disk, yep, everything's mirrored. And that's the only places that I normally have to deal with this, which typically means my Vio servers. So, but I've also been known to break the mirror, take my Maxisb and put the mirror back.
Okay. So, you know, you mentioned, and maybe this is an easy question, you mentioned that your NIM has to be at the latest level to deal with, you know, that level on other systems. So the question is, if your NIM is at 7200-05-XX, so you're at 725, can you apply a service pack to 7220-04-XX?
That doesn't, I don't understand that.
Okay, it's kind of hard with all me reading, saying all the numbers, I suppose.
No. I saw that question before, and I was trying to. I mean, if you're running your NIM at 7251, which is the latest, and you want to update it to 7252, yeah, you can update it. It's not gonna stop supporting the stuff that it's already supporting. You can't go back level. So
I think Tim, the guy who wrote the question, actually put a follow on because he actually had a typo. He said, basic question is, can you use NIM to update NIM clients that are a TL below the NIM server? Well,
absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, if you look at, let me just. If you look at my, share my screen again. Yeah, so if you look at my LS NIM here, I have LPPs and Maxisbs for all kinds of levels. 7.2 TL1, VIOS 310, 7, you know, but I also have ones. Oh yeah, I got rid of all my 7.1 stuff, but I can restore, I can have, you know, AIX 7.1. Technically, I could have an AIX 6.1 resource. So whatever you can build a spot and LPP for, you should be able to do updates for. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, you used to be able to install newer LPPs from an older OS level on NIM, but there's an issue that the spot, I think it is, has to be at the highest level and the alt disk commands have to be. So it's just best practice. Update your NIM server first and keep your Up Nem server current. And you should be able to do that because the NIM server shouldn't be being accessed by anything other than people doing NIM work and backups.
And then the other thing I would mention is we need to be pack rats with original base images. Store them on your NIM server, never lose them. Every month or so I get a client contacting me and saying, do you have the .0 basically version of this file set because we no longer have it and we can't do an update. So NIM is a great place to store all that stuff. Keep all those base images, never lose them, never delete them. You never know when you'll need them.
I have a huge directory on my NIM server called /software, and there's a subdirectory called ISOs. And, because I used to get shipped the CDs and they took up half my house. Now I rip every CD to an ISO, upload it to the NIM server, and that's where it lives. And I give it meaningful names, like AIX7251-base.iso or whatever. Because I don't like those really long names that IBM uses. They're just too long to type in. But I also regularly back up my NIM volume group, which is where /software/NIM and /backups live, because if I lose that, I'm toast. And that's the thing you've got to remember. You can take Maxisbs of NIM, but please don't forget to back up the other file systems that might be a NIMVG or some other volume group.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop here. I want to, first of all, thank Jackie for doing this. I know you were working on the presentation all the way up until just before you sent it me yesterday, and then even changes today. So I appreciate the time and that you joining us to share your experience and knowledge with the community here.
Well, thank you, and I hope it was helpful.
Well, based on the comments I've seen and all the questions and stuff, I definitely think it was. Tom, thanks also for jumping in here and answering questions and helping out. It's a big help to me and a big help to everybody that's on. Really appreciate that too.
My pleasure.
So with that, everybody, thanks for joining today, and there'll be another session next month. I don't have it set up yet, so I can't announce what it is, but the usual invites and messages will be coming out for that when I get it all done. So with that, have a good month, rest of your month, a good spring, and hope we're all welcoming in summer. Thanks, everyone. So long.
Thanks, Joe. Do you need me to stay on, little Joe?
No, you can get off. I'm just saving off the files, and then I'll end everything. I have to save off these files before I do that, though, Jackie.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let me know if you need me to look at any of the Q&A later.
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.